And welcome back to This Week in the State House. As the session continues, we had disruption because of the weather, but nevertheless, this General Assembly is moving forward with issues. We're going to take a look at an issue today which has been bubbling around in the House, in the Senate. Ethics reform. What is ethics reform? What does it entail? Who does it apply to? What's the rub here? What's the need? We're going to take a look at all of those issues, but before we do, a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I want to thank Time Warner Cable and the South Carolina Farm Bureau for the sponsorship and making this broadcast possible. Also, Educational Television. They are the producers of this show, and with the assistance and association of the South Carolina Press Association, we're able to bring this broadcast to you. And I know that makes our friends in 518 of the Block Building always happy, because this show fills the need for them on information. So I hope y'all will give them some good information today. Got two guests here we're going to talk. Right here to my immediate right, Senator from Darlington, Senator Gerald Malloy. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, sir.
Right next to him, Senator Chip Campsen, comes from the same county I do, Charleston. And it's a pleasure to have both of you. Both of these gentlemen are active in the ethics debate. So let's get right down to it. Senator Campsen, I'm going to start with you. For the viewers out there, in a nutshell, what's ethics reform? What is that? Is it a law or what?
Well, the ethics reform proposal is a bill to make some changes to current laws on the books that deal with ethics. And ethics is the ethics laws in this state deal with what public officials, which include elected officials and also public employees, like a director of a state agency would be a public official, for example. Requires them to report their business interests, for example, so you would know what a potential conflict of interest may be if someone is casting a vote that could be constitute a conflict of interest. When it comes to elected officials, ethics laws govern our campaign finance reports, wherein we have to file our sources and uses of campaign funds. Ethics laws control what you can use those funds for. Like, there's been several cases recently of pertaining to members dealing with whether they appropriately use their campaign funds or not. And so ethics is a set of laws that control those types of behaviors, those type of activity. A lot of it is about full disclosure, is really what the ethics laws are about. In some ways it's a misnomer, because sometimes folks can just inadvertently misreport something or put an erroneous figure on maybe a campaign contribution, and it's deemed an ethics violation in the press, when really it's just the Scribner's error. But of course sometimes ethics violations truly are violating, the transcendent codes of moral conduct as well. And so it is really a term that encompasses a lot of things. Some of it really important stuff, some of it really just kind of technical, almost Scribner type stuff, accounting type stuff.
Well, some of these ethics laws, campaign laws and whatever, set limits on a donation.
Correct.
I understand that. And then they also require disclosure.
Correct.
Now, you said it's about elected officials in the legislature, but how about elected officials, for instance, those of us in the executive branch?
Same thing. You're subject to the ethics laws as well. You're a public official, the executive branch, constitutional officers, and also even some of the employees, the directors of agencies and such.
All right, so we have a set of laws right now.
And there's a separate set of ethics for the judicial branch. There's a separate set of code of conduct in the judicial branch.
All right, so we have a judicial code of ethics. Then we have everybody that's running in ethics in government. And our viewers know we got 3 branches of government, distinct branches. Now, who oversees things in the executive branch, and who oversees things in the legislative branch, and who oversees things in the judicial branch?
Well,
ethics.
Let me take a stab at ethics. I would say is to ensure that we honor the responsibility of our office. We take an oath that we are going to, when we are elected, for example, legislators, that we are take an oath that we're going to uphold the Constitution, that we're going to do these certain things in our oath. These laws that are there help govern us, and it also helps us to account on our public matters. And people will get a chance to end up observing that, particularly in those that are transparent. And most of the things we try to make as transparent as possible. I see that we're going to discuss the three branches of government: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative, which is really critical because our founders wanted to make certain that we had these checks and balances, that no one controlled the other. And so they're independent bodies. There are times when someone tramples on the other side that we got to back up and say, no, the legislative doesn't control the judicial doesn't control the legislative, but sometimes we'll pass a law and the judicial may have to help interpret as to what the legislative intent was. And so what we have now is that we have laws that we are looking at for ethics. Some are already on the books, but it will govern part of the executive as well, because we have a state ethics commission and we have our Senate ethics committee and a House ethics committee. That's unique, and that is a real significant point, because the Constitution says each body controls its own members. And I think that this is critical in this discussion, because we got to make certain that we stay consistent with what we think the founders meant in the separation of powers.
Who appoints the current State Ethics Commission?
Governor.
The governor. All right. Now, in one of the issues here, some of the reforms that were proposed is to put the legislature under the Ethics Commission.
Yes, that's an issue in this debate. I think that issue is really no longer in play. However, as Senator Malloy indicated, a fundamental issue in this whole ethics debate is whether you maintain the separation of the three different branches of government. And the founders created those three branches, as the Senator indicated, to diffuse political power. They didn't trust human nature to wield concentrated political power. This is the most fundamental guiding principle that the founders in the federal Constitution and in the state constitutions embraced. And in order to be an effective check and balance on the other branches, each branch of government needs to be in control of its own internal matters. And that's why we have in Article 3, Section 12 of our Constitution a provision that the Senator referenced that says each chamber, each legislative chamber shall, not may, it uses the imperative, shall discipline its members. And so that's been early on in this debate, that was a big issue that we were debating back and forth, because there were some proposals to have the executive branch discipline members of the legislative branch. But in their wisdom, the founders realized that that would be imprudent, because if one branch can discipline members of another branch, it increases the power of that branch who is able to do the discipline, weakens the competing rival branch, and disrupts the checks and balances of the separation of powers. After all, the founders, more than anything else, like Jefferson said, place no confidence in man when it comes to liberty, but bind them, government officials, by the chains of the Constitution. By the structure of the Constitution is what the founders had faith in, not the benevolence and good and of human nature. Because human beings, unfortunately, will attempt to consolidate political power, and if you let one branch discipline another, that's like letting Dabo Swinney discipline the Gamecock football players before the Clemson-Carolina game. I'll bet you, some of the best players like Clowney and others would be on the sideline, because there'd be something that wasn't quite right. So anyway, there's an incentive to discipline unfairly other members, and so the founders also knew that by letting one branch discipline itself, some folks may get away, particularly with some stuff, particularly in the legislative branch, but they considered that acceptable. You read James Madison in Federalist 57, he says at the end of the day, they have to stand for election, and the public is the ultimate discipline for them. But it's important not to disrupt.
Balance of checks and balances is what I hear both of you saying. So the public out there can understand, it's not the legislature trying to just protect itself. It's y'all trying to protect the Constitution.
Trying not to disrupt that balance of powers.
Not
It protects the
disrupt that
people.
balance of power.
Try to protect the people, really,
Right.
from government abuse, from too much consolidation and too much power.
So let me ask you, we got a system set up, constitutional balance of power and everything, each branch in check of itself. Why is there this debate now for ethics reform? What's the big driving force here?
Well, you know, I think that where we started during the ethics reform debate is that there was some discussion that we sort of moving away from now, that the governor would end up appointing the committee, state ethics committee, and they would have some control over legislators. Well, that's tantamount then to giving the governor, the executive, control over the legislature.
Why would you want to give somebody that much power?
I don't think that in the end anyone would really want that power, because I think that it would be so disruptive in the end that it would be problematic, and I think that people would actually revolt, and you would then have a dampening effect upon people serving in the legislature. Right now we have a citizens legislature. The public eye is on us. The issue becomes is that, you know, what is corrupt? What are we fixing? When we start talking about reform, you want to fix something that is corrupt or depraved, something that is absolutely problematic. And so what we have to do is point to a situation that has not been handled. Where is the problem?
That's my question to y'all, because the viewers want to know, why is this up on the front burner? What's the driving force here?
Well, the other thing is perception is the reality. I don't think they really know until they kick the wheels and raise the hood. You look under it and say, what are we going to find? And basically what you have now is that you have a debate that is going on, and no one really knows what are we fixing. What we're doing is in my view, is just guesswork. And so do we need to end up changing how long you have to go back to find an ethics violation? Do you, how much money should you contribute to a campaign? I mean, there's a whole myriad of things. Can a lobbyist have to register if they are lobbying before county government, the one that's closest to people? Should we have to recuse ourselves from even discussing someone that we may have a potential conflict about? Are we taking away the power from people? Candidly, we don't get a lot of calls to say, please, you all, let's do ethics reform. You don't hear that from the general public, at least in my view.
Well, I'll say one, you know, we're doing a lot of good things in this bill. One is an independent investigation, but of a member of the legislature, but yet how the results of that investigation are handled resides and remains with the legislative ethics committees, as the Constitution requires, in honor of that separation of powers doctrine and the balances and checks that it provides, as we discussed earlier. And so I think there's some interest in the public of having that kind of independent eye, that independent investigation. And so what the proposals before us are all different iterations, really, of some independent investigation, but the actual judgment as to what the consequences of the findings of the investigation will be reside with the legislative ethics committees, as the Constitution requires. We have some good things dealing with super PACs who can spend money, unlimited amounts of money, without really reporting the contribution and the manner in which they're spending it. And we have in the bill a provision whereby these super PACs will have to start reporting who their contributors are and how they spend money.
They don't have to report, in other words, under current law?
Under current law, because of a federal Supreme Court decision. It's not because we had a loophole in our law, it's because
I
the
hear you.
Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, and I use that tongue-in-cheek, handed down a decision a few years ago that really just made it wild, wild west when it comes to raising money and spending money, trying to defeat a candidate, as long as you're not a candidate yourself, as long as you're some independent PAC. And so we also have a provision that would eliminate leadership PACs, where members of the General Assembly or constitutional officers raise money, PAC money, and then make contributions to members of the General Assembly. We're eliminating
the Senate
that.
prohibits that already.
Yeah, the
Senate
Senate already prohibited that.
In Rule 54.
And really, the Senate has done a pretty good job dealing with ethics. I mean, we just had out of Charleston County, we had a member who resigned last year that the Senate Ethics Committee handled, and it was a difficult situation. There were some procedural difficulties that is too much inside baseball to go into, but the committee handled it well, and the member ended up resigning. And if you look what's happened in the House, it has not been, it hasn't, I think the House has been subject to more criticism. I mean, one reason is that their ethics committee, until just a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, was not bipartisan. It only had one member of the minority party in a 10-member committee. I think it's 10 members. The Senate has always tried, and when you were the leader of the Senate, Governor, you really helped develop this ethic and this ethos, this principle and commitment to really just nonpartisanship. And the Senate Ethics Committee has an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and it truly is, I think, not even bipartisan, it's simply a nonpartisan entity. And I think you saw it perform well last year in the ethics case we had out of Charleston County.
Well, let me ask the two of y'all, because I haven't heard much on this since we're talking about, I've seen some discussion about the legislature, and I hear y'all talking about we got some things done, that there's an attempt to split, as I understand it, Senator, the ethics thing, so there's an independent investigative body. But now, if they can do that for one branch of government, why can't they do that for all three? Is that in the bill, or is it only apply to the legislature?
It only applies to the legislature as of now from the bill that has been reported out of committee. But I think you'll see in an amendment that it will stretch to another branch of government, because if it's constitutional for one branch, then it should be constitutional for another branch.
All right, let me ask y'all this. How about in the current law? Can people who do business with the state of South Carolina, vendors who do business with this state, can they contribute to members of the legislature or the executive branch under current law?
People that do business?
Who do business, have contracts with the state, can they turn around and give campaign donations to members of the executive and legislative branches of the government?
I think so, unless they can't exceed the limit, but the limitations are there. We have in the Senate and the House, we have $1,000 per entity per cycle, and I think they can do that. Statewide, I think it's $3,500 per cycle. That could be a primary and a general, so certainly they can end up contributing, and there begs another question. Then what would happen then if they contribute whenever there's a matter that comes before any of us that we will have to end up maybe appointing them to something, or if they were to serve on a board of some sort? There's a question is that whether or not they would be able to do that if we really want to end up having an ethics bill. And while we're there, we mentioned a situation with a member. Sometimes we talk about extreme cases, but if you look at the website, the Senate Ethics Committee handles a lot of cases for just a matter of filing something late. They list those out for the public to be able to look. For legislator didn't file this disclosure on time, they'll end up, there may be a penalty with it. They list those out. The penalties are beside the members' names. It's a pretty strict thing. And what we're doing now is that we're seeking a legislative fix for what could be problems from other places. And so if you're going to put this issue upon the legislature, then what we got to figure out is that what are we trying to fix? What are we trying to reform? Are we making something more transparent? Is that the fix? Because right now, we have to make certain that we guard these members, the folks that choose to serve, against a lot of frivolous complaints as well. And sometimes the damage is done once the complaint is filed. There's a lot of matters that have no basis, that they're politically motivated or otherwise motivated. And the thing is that in this world that we live in and we serve in now, there's a lot of gotcha politics. And I think that what happens, gotcha politics. And you got to make certain that you continue to have people that, just like yourself, that would dedicate their life to end up giving service to the citizens in this state. If we make it such a problem that we're going to end up having folks not willing to serve because they don't want to go through the process, then it's a disservice to this state.
Senator, do you have any comments you want to make on that?
Yeah, I would. Another issue that was an issue early on in this debate is whether you require members of the General Assembly to disclose the amount of their income or just the source of their income. I mean, right now you don't disclose the source or the amount, and so the proposal that's before us now at this stage of the debate is that you disclose just your source of income and not your amount. Now, I think it's important to not make members disclose their amount as long as we are going to remain a citizen legislature. I think it's very important for us to remain a citizen legislature, by the way. You want to see a non-citizen legislature in action, look at Congress. And if you think Congress is doing a good job, then that's what you'll get. Because I want people who run businesses, who run law practices, who are doctors, who are working and living in the real world. I want them making laws for me. If I'm not someone who is detached and is just a full-time politician like in DC. And if you make members of the General Assembly report their amount of income, you're going to run every business person out the General Assembly. And if you do that, we're going to have a lot worse lawmaking. And they pay congressmen $178,000 a year. We get $22,000 a year. So if you don't think the $178,000 a year quality of representation is good in Congress, just wait till you see $22,000 a year quality representation, because that's what you get here. Because no businessman's going to want his competitors to see, where his income is coming from, how much it is. You would just put business people at such a disadvantage that they'd never serve. And I want people who have to live and work under the laws that are passed. Those are the ones I want making the laws.
Well, isn't the key to the income disclosure to indicate where a potential interest
It's just
or
potential conflict.
Why does it have to be the exact amount of money?
It doesn't. It's just as long as you identify the source, you see a potential conflict, then you can determine, whether the people need to recuse themselves or not from a vote.
Well, I'll go back to an earlier question. I mean, if somebody's doing business with the state, don't you have, and they're given to a candidate, they got to disclose that. Isn't that the concept, is to put disclosure out there?
That's
so
correct.
Why would you require the exact dollar if you're just looking for the nature of the conflict? Why is there so much attention on getting the exact dollar?
Some people just, they want to know. I mean, it's like, I don't know.
We're
but I see
fascinated with
no
big
beneficial.
things.
I can start to make a stronger argument about, hell, if you're going to do business with the state, you shouldn't be contributing to politicians. I mean, that argument could be made.
And I want to make this point, too, that members of the General Assembly have virtually no influence on these contractual matters you're talking about. That's something that happens at the state level. I mean, DOT may contract with a paving company. I mean, we don't have any influence on that anyway.
Yeah.
We don't affect. Yeah, people think we do, but we don't. So.
Well, we got just a couple of minutes left in this broadcast. Is there anything y'all would like to say about this bill that you think the public really ought to take a look at, or that you think is coming up? And your prediction, is it will become law, or is it?
Well, I would start with that. Just say, one, that as of yesterday, there's 60 amendments on the desk. And what that means is that there's going to be a spirited debate if we get to that point. I think that it would be healthy to have the discussion, because the things that we're talking about now, those are the things that have not been debated. We had them come out of the committee, but it hasn't been debated on the Senate floor. Does it become law? I think you have to tune in and see. I think it's going to be a difficult bill to end up passing.
Is it going to be a spirited debate? I would ask both of you. You going to have some good speeches and some.
Well,
Because ETV broadcasts these sessions live, and these viewers may want to tap into
In a
this.
word, yes.
Well, you know, the Senate at the end of the day, it'll debate, and you know this, you helped establish this pattern, really, where the Senate is not so much a deliberative body, but a negotiating body. I mean, the rules give minority members of the minority party rights, you know, extended debate rights, et cetera. And any individual, it's not just party, but anyone who really has something under the craw, they can filibuster, they can talk, and it causes us to strike a deal and negotiate. And so we may have some debate. At the end of the day, if it passes, it's going to be a negotiated deal, which means no one gets everything that they want. And that's the way the Senate is designed to work.
So you ought to tell it, what you're telling the viewers there is they may see some clashes on the floor, but there's some negotiation going on across the table somewhere.
There's a lot of negotiation.
Is that, would that be a fair assessment to those viewers out there?
Yep, you taught us all to do that. So.
Well, we are just about out of time, and I hope our viewers begin to see it. It's a complex subject, a lot of different issues. We barely, I think y'all would agree, just scratched the surface. Unfortunately for us, we're limited on time, and we're out of time, and we got to go, and we thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another issue here at This Week in the State House.
Broadcast of this program is made possible in part by Time Warner Cable, online at timewarnercable.com, and by the South Carolina Farm Bureau, online at scfb.org.